Team, welcome back to the Live, Perform, Compete podcast. I'm joined with a repeat guest, Mr. Kyle Ruth, who is also my coach, my personal coach. Been working together for many a year now. Kyle was on one of the early episodes of the Live, Perform, Compete podcast, and he is back. Kyle, welcome.
Hello. Hello, Ed.
So, Kyle, today we are talking about one subject in particular, something that is talked about quite a lot at the moment. I think we're going to dig into that as well, which is basically nasal breathing. So basically to our listeners, I had a guest, Brian Lai, who's from the breathing community, a student at Wim Hof, really talk about the concept of nasal breathing, why it's beneficial. We talked a lot about CO2 tolerance and all the kind of amazing health benefits that came along with it. And I think since then, people have really started to kind of do their own research and look into and experiment with nasal breathing, particularly within kind of my communities here in Hong Kong and on our online programming communities, the process programming. But there's definitely a bit of, there's a lot of information to try and digest. And I think the application of it and how to actually use it both in life and training is perhaps being taken not incorrectly, but people aren't not wrapping our heads around the topic as well as we possibly could do.
Yeah,
so
not necessarily using it in ways that would be like universally beneficial for their training and health and things like that. Yeah, totally follow.
Okay, and so the reason I thought about bringing you on the podcast, Carl, was, well, firstly, in our own training, in my training, you brought the concept of nasal breathing in training to my attention. And the first thing you said was read the book, Oxygen Advantage. And so I went away and read that, and that kind of opened my mind up to a whole new side of breath work, training, carbon dioxide, oxygen, all the things that are entailed with the nasal breathing. Kind of led me on my own little path or my own little journey of research and discovery. Ended up having really good conversations with people like Brian. And of course, under your guidance, I'm experimenting a little bit more with training, but experimenting a lot with kind of nasal breathing in life in general. So be incorporating things like sleep rituals, their own kind of separate training protocols, and of course in training. So I know you've dived down the subject quite a bit. So perhaps let's start with, where did your kind of journey with nasal breathing begin, and why have you kind of dived down the rabbit hole so far?
Yeah. So I started as a skeptic. When people got onto the nose breathing, I don't want to call it a craze because I think there's a ton of value to it. But when people really jumped on the nose breathing bandwagon back in like 2014, 2015, I was just a staunch skeptic, right? Like that's typically my stance on things early on. I don't think I'm an early adopter. So everyone was doing it, and I was like, man, this is stupid. And I tried it. And at the time, I think I had, I don't know, it's probably not a deviated septum, but I had some sinus stuff going on that pretty much made it so it was impossible for me to really exercise while nasal breathing. And so I kind of just dismissed it. And that's around the time, 15, 16 was around when Oxygen Advantage was published. And there were actually people at TTT that were recommending I read it. And I just kind of breezed by it. I was like, the mouth is such a bigger airway. You can get so much more oxygen, and I just ignored it. But this past summer, I read the book Breath. And as I was listening to it, I was like, man, physiologically, this, a lot of the stuff he's talking about makes sense. And then I started to think through my breathing history in sports. And I've had exercise-induced asthma since I was a kid. When I was a really little kid, I was at my grandparents, and they had a bucket of chlorine for their pool. And I opened that bucket and basically like stuck my head in, and I had some pretty traumatic lung injury as a result of that. Spent a couple of days in the hospital. And since then, so pretty much my entire life, I've had a pretty reactive airways. It just takes a small amount of cold, dry air and a little bit of Fran, and I would be in a really bad place with respiratory infections, all kinds of stuff. And I just kind of dealt with it my entire athletic career. And as I was reading Breath, it was like, he was kind of explaining a lot of the physiological mechanisms, why that might be happening to me as a chronic mouth breather who has reactive airway. So I decided, this was probably May of 2020, that I was going to I was going to make some changes. I was going to start nose breathing consistently throughout my day. I was going to learn to run and operate during exercise at low enough intensities that I could nose breathe. That didn't mean that all my training was being done at low nose breathing intensities, but I needed to get to the point that I could do it. I bought some nasal turbines, right? Some little things that you stick in your nose and they dilate your airway so that I could run with my crappy sinuses. And I went through the process of doing some breath hold exercises to try and open up my nose and make it so I could breathe. And I trained myself to sleep while breathing through my nose. And the process of doing that dramatically changed the way that my airways and my lungs and my respiratory system operated during training. I followed that up, in the middle of that by reading Oxygen Advantage. And during that time, I was actually prepping to compete in a live event at Masters Fitness Collective. And by about I would say 8th week, I just noticed a massive difference in how my breathing felt both in Metcons at high intensities and during, long endurance. In fact, I was doing long endurance runs for the first time in my life and like feeling comfortable the entire time. And I say, to be clear, that's long endurance runs for a CrossFitter, which is like 4 to 5 miles versus, long endurance runs for a long endurance runner. But I felt comfortable the entire time. And I'd never had that experience before in my, 25-year training history. So I noticed a lot of change really fast. And that's kind of how I got into it.
Okay. So outside of the training side of things, you obviously you noticed improvements in your ability to perform in metabolic conditioning settings. Did you notice any other difference outside of the training scenario?
Well, a couple of things. So the first one is I have notoriously had chronic upper respiratory tract or sinus infections from training. As soon as the weather would, as soon as we get to like fall and things would start to cool off a little bit, I would end up with sinus or respiratory infections from training. Almost, I could not tell you the last time that I didn't have 6 or 7 respiratory infections throughout the fall, winter, and spring months. I'd always get one in the middle of the open. I'd always get one, early in the fall and get a really nasty infection. And typically they would last like a week, 2 weeks. And, I'd be hacking up a lung and it would affect training quality. And I'd end up missing multiple sessions. And it just made it so that I couldn't really do what I wanted to do. In fact, that was one of the reasons that I took a break from competing in CrossFit, is because I was sick all the time. And it turns out I was sick all the time when I wasn't training to compete. So it wasn't really a good solution. This is the first time, and granted, this isn't, we're in January, but I've literally not had any sinus or respiratory infections where everybody around me has. You know what I mean? It used to be if I was the first one that would get it, and then I would give it to everybody else. And at this point, I just I just haven't been sick. Now, hopefully I can continue to say that for an extended period of time, but my airways and my respiratory system are just fundamentally more resilient than they have been. I'm not going to say that it's like immune to infection or anything like that, but I can train a lot harder and I can go a lot deeper in Metcons and not end up with pretty severe respiratory infections. And to be honest, like you do that enough and you just pretty much stay sick all the time. So that's a big one. The other one is, before I started getting into nose breathing and really just trying to improve my respiratory health, like that's probably the way I really look at this. I could not inhale through my left nostril. Like I was pretty sure after reading Breath and like him talking about some of the stuff that he went through with the surgery, I was like, I'm going to have some kind of sinus surgery if I ever want to breathe through my left nostril. Well, that's not true. After doing enough, nose breathing work, using the nasal dilators so that I could just go out and actually inhale through both nostrils while running, and teaching myself to sleep while nose breathing and just adopting those things and doing some of the nose unblocking exercises that Patrick McKeown talked about, I can now breathe freely through both nostrils. And someone who's listening to this that has never had any sinus issues in their life and could breathe freely through both, would probably not think that that's that big of a deal. Or if you have like occasional blockage on one side, like you're probably like, whatever, not a big deal. No, it's a very good feeling to be able to breathe through both nostrils freely. And, honestly, that's something I think a lot of people end up, a reason that they avoid nose breathing is because when they do, they're like, man, it just feels like there's no air going in there. I know that feeling, and it does go away. It was a very interesting thing, but now, I've got more oxygen that passes through my nose at any given time. There's more CO2 passing through there. So the airways are more dilated. The blood vessels are more dilated. And, I think that's one of the ways that it stays healthy. The best way to give yourself a sinus infection is to get a blocked up nose. Let all that anaerobic bacteria, which, dies in the presence of oxygen, just start to fester in there. Now I'm getting plenty of air through the airways. And I think that's, they're kind of like self-reinforcing that the health improves by getting the nose to function the way that it's supposed to.
Yeah. And I mean, okay, you're just about to get into some of the benefits of nasal breathing. You were kind of starting to touch on them, but I just want to just rewind really quickly. I think the general movement and the conversations about nasal breathing, like you said, were coming up in kind of 2014, 15. Obviously, the recent book Breath by James Nestor, Pat McKeown's Oxygen Advantage. Of course, both of them have just been on Joe Rogan quite recently, and that's obviously brought kind of breath work into kind of mainstream media. It's talked about a lot more. I think Wim Hof as well, taking lots of like really ancient philosophies on breathing to the mainstream media has also brought more attention to it. But I think, the most important thing, and I kind of just said it there, is that the concept of nasal breathing isn't new, is it? It's something that, ancient tribes and generations of human beings have been practicing, forever and ever and ever. The animal kingdom is predominantly a nasal breathing species apart from humans who kind of fucked it all up.
I'll say this. I'll say this for us humans. If there's one thing that I have found is that we are incredibly adaptable. Yeah. That's our advantage, right? Our advantage is that we can choose to breathe through our mouth if necessary, or through our nose. Same thing, like adaptability to the heat, adaptability to the cold. Like we are just really damn adaptable creatures. I'll just put it that way.
Yes. Okay, so let's go back to where you were starting to get onto, which is, the general benefits of nasal breathing. So someone's a skeptic, someone's listening to this and they're thinking, why should I even investigate or explore or experiment the concept of nasal breathing? Let's talk about the benefits of nasal breathing to just general health.
Sure. So I think the primary one that's touted is the increase in PCO2 in the blood. So essentially, we've got there's more, but there's two primary gases that we think about in the blood, right? And the first is oxygen and second is carbon dioxide. And oxygen is incredibly important. Our tissues need it at all moments in order to survive. As we know from an exercise perspective, when oxygen drops to zero, exercise comes to a halt. Evan Picon, one of the TTT coaches, has done such a good job of explaining that. But CO2 is the other one it plays a massive role in both health and, athletic performance. So from a health perspective, carbon dioxide is a vasodilator, which means that it opens up blood vessels, right? And if blood vessels are restricted, things like elevated blood pressure, cold fingers, all those types of things, those things happen. And restricted blood flow, which means the tissues are getting less oxygen. So essentially, carbon dioxide serves as a regulator of vasodilation. And it also, vasodilates the blood vessels in the brain, where a lot of people, they go through life experiencing this chronic brain fog. And what may really be happening is they may be in this state of like chronic overbreathing or hyperventilation, blowing off CO2. By blowing off CO2, they're constricting the blood vessels in their brain, and it clouds your thinking, gives you high blood pressure, and has a number of different effects on the body. Nose breathing, by definition, just kind of captures more CO2, right? Because you're breathing less total volume and you're keeping more of the CO2 in the lungs. And that is unless you're breathing as massive breaths. It's basically impossible to hyperventilate through your nose. I mean, not impossible, but at rest, if I'm talking to you and you were trying to hyperventilate right now through your nose, it would be so obvious, and your airways close when you inhale that aggressively, right? Like your nostrils actually like clamp down. So essentially, from a health perspective, the CO2 piece is a big one. The other one is that CO2 actually creates a shift in what's called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So basically, your red blood cells can change how sticky they are, how much oxygen sticks to them. And the CO2 goes up, they become a little less sticky, which means that for those of us who are nose breathers, our hemoglobin basically lets go of oxygen a little more freely to the tissues. So more of the oxygen that is in your blood at any given moment can actually be delivered to the brain, muscles, liver, whatever organ it needs to get to at that moment. So that's where CO2 comes into play. There's also some really strong evidence that CO2 dysregulation. So a person breathing off too much CO2 and hyperventilating is one of the things that is a predictor or a cause of asthma. So, from a respiratory health perspective, being able to increase the your just kind of resting levels of CO2 can decrease the risk for asthma. It also has some impact on nitric oxide, which is another really potent, more potent vasodilator. That nose breathing increases nitric oxide in the airways. It can increase nitric oxide in the lungs, and again, dilate some of the airways, dilate some of the blood vessels, and basically just make things function a little bit more efficiently, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where we were going to take this now was basically to then talk about the advantage of nasal breathing in the training space. You kind of touched on a lot of those concepts already. But let's go into that right away, which is, the benefits of nasal breathing. Why would it be worthwhile for someone in the sports performance space? And obviously there's a million different sports that people could be competing in, but if performance is something that's important to you, why might the concept of, increasing your ability to tolerate carbon dioxide and moving breathing to the nose, why might that be advantageous?
Well, I think the most primary is that by getting people more tolerant of CO2, whether that's through nose breathing, breath holds, or whatever it is, by becoming more tolerant of CO2, you reduce the sensation of breathlessness during exercise. So what'll happen is you just feel less out of breath at the same intensities. So let's say you're working at 90% of your heart rate max on the assault bike. With a low CO2 tolerance, it's going to feel like there's a really high demand on your respiration. And if you have a very high CO2 tolerance, it's going to feel like there's a low demand on your respiration, because CO2 is our primary driver that basically when CO2 levels get elevated, it tells our brain to breathe. And it's our primary driver for stimulating respiration. If you were to hold your breath right now, the thing that makes you feel like you need to take a breath and kind of gasp for air afterward is elevated CO2. So I think that's a big factor is driving down your sensation of being out of breath. Most people, if you talk to them and they get done with a Metcon or they get done with, hard intervals, and you ask them, you start to prod, you're like, well, why did you slow down? What was keeping you from going faster? Oh man, my breathing was out of control. That right there tells you, like, what's the primary thing that most people pay attention to in training, in Metcons, and competition, to know when they need to stop, to know when they need to take a break? Well, it's their breathing. And if you have something like CO2 tolerance that you can regulate, or that you can impact to make it so that they feel less out of breath, then you're going to delay the point at which they feel like they need to take a break. Right? You do that and you kind of start to think through the implications of that in a Metcon, and that's huge. So I think that's a big factor. The other factor to me is that, our breathing in training. So during, really high, again, like 90% plus heart rate max stuff, which is like where every Metcon lives and like most competitive events live, our breathing uses up to 35% of our total oxygen consumption, or total energy usage, right? And so what's happening is our heart is a closed circuit, which means it has to pump blood to the working muscles. It has to pump blood to the brain, obviously, or else you're going to pass out. It has to pump blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And then it has to pump blood to the respiratory muscles so that they can keep doing their job, right? So they can keep functioning. And the more efficient those respiratory muscles are, the less blood and oxygen they're going to need. So that's where people, start using breath trainers, right? So like doing inspiratory or expiratory muscle training, using things like a power lung, a power breathe, things like that. But there's another layer to this as well. If you just decrease the frequency of breathing, if you decrease the depth of the breath, then again, you're going to need less oxygen and blood for those respiratory muscles. So you're going to take it from, let's say, 33 to 35% of your total energy is being used just to breathe, and you create less demand on breathing, lower that down to 20 to 25%. Well, now you have more blood volume to send to the muscle tissue so that you can actually maintain higher paces. Now, that's going to require improved oxygen extraction from the blood, which is going to be that left shift, so increasing CO2, and it's going to mean that you have to have a lower respiratory frequency. I think, from a sports performance perspective, that the real kicker would be combining inspiratory, expiratory muscle training with some type of CO2 tolerance work for athletes who need it. Now, I'm not going to say that across the board, everybody needs to improve their CO2 tolerance, but we may talk more about that. But I think most CrossFitters could use to improve their CO2 tolerance to some degree and would see improvement in sport performance. Most endurance athletes, I think that might be a little bit more debatable. I think there could be some performance ramifications from driving up their CO2 tolerance too high.
Interesting. So I think so it's twofold is what you're saying. There's number one, the actual process of nasal breathing during exercise has advantages, in slowing down breath cadence and the amount of oxygen coming in, and therefore the amount of CO2 that's dispelled. And then number two.
Yep. And I think, let me jump in real quick on that. I think there are psychological adaptations to that as well, that learning to exercise with lower respiration rates, with less overall, breathing rate, or less depth of breathing by breathing through your nose. By doing that, you have a psychological adaptation to being more comfortable and more tolerant to the feeling of, being more out of breath, essentially.
It's actually a really good point. I think a lot of people, especially people who aren't aware of breath, or people who come into, let's say, a very aerobically driven sport like CrossFit, and they haven't done maybe heaps of breathing work previously, is that they associate, energy system training or the Metcon with fast breathing. And so, their rate of respiration in their warm up is the same as a rate of respiration in the middle of a Metcon, which is the same as a rate of respiration at the end of a Metcon. And I think, a lot of people don't even put any thought towards, the importance of regulating that. And so the association of deep, fast breathing is triggering that. Yeah. That's something I didn't really think about. I think so. So the number one part is, the awareness and the slowing down of breath by using nasal protocols in a training session or when you're exercising. But number two, the adaptations that take place on a physiological level when you move to more nasal breathing-esque living and, training protocols is going to benefit you even when you're not necessarily nasal breathing in the exercise scenario. So you may be mouth breathing in the moment, but the nasal protocols done before that and in general day life is going to benefit you in that moment.
Yeah. My general recommendation for people who are athletes who want to mess with nasal breathing, well, first is to test, right? To see where your CO2 tolerance might be, because you may not want to impact your CO2 tolerance. You might already be really tolerant and not know it. But my general recommendation is nose breathe all day, nose breathe at night when you're asleep, right? Those things are good for your respiratory health. They're just good for you in general. Now, whether or not to incorporate nose breathing into training, that I think is more debatable based upon your your CO2 tolerance set point. We can talk about Bolt score and how to quickly and just, easily assess your CO2 tolerance. But for people that are going to integrate it, like, keep in mind that just like in training, there's different paces that you move at, right? So sometimes you train at like a jogging pace. Sometimes you train at a walking pace. Sometimes you train at an all out maximal effort sprint. Sometimes when you're lifting, you lift light loads, you lift heavy loads, you do technical drills, and then you do maxes, right? So there's a spectrum that you train with. And if you leave out any part of that spectrum, then you're going to be ill prepared to compete. I think the same is true with breathing, right? So learn to go at slow paces while nasal breathing. Learn to go at jogging paces while nasal breathing. Learn where the edge, where your individual limit for nose breathing is. And then when you compete, now you have tools to be able to regulate your pacing. And when you compete, all right, this is the edge of where I can nose breathe. And I know to be competitive, I'm going to have to go way past that. So make sure you're training at intensities that require you to breathe through your mouth. Like, there's the reality is, if you're in a sport like CrossFit that does have varied time domains and modalities, then you're going to have flexible breathing, not just one style of all mouth breathing or all nose breathing. And anybody who hasn't developed those tools is going to be at a disadvantage when they go to compete.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So I think I'm actually going to share an example from my session today, which you'd prescribe, which is basically a ramping protocol on a rower. We were doing 1,000 meter repeats. And actually the prescription wasn't to do the actual work using nasal breathing. It was do the work. So basically every 200 meters, you can increase your pace, finishing roughly at like your 2K row pace, and then rest as long as you need to until you get back to comfortable nasal breathing. And so, I've been playing around with nasal breathing for the last couple months. Been using it in kind of mixed modal deloads. So kind of, when the intensity is really taken out of it, and the intention for the session is just to kind of move, and you kind of moving it kind of low to moderate heart rates. That for me was kind of comfortable. Of course, there are certain movements that elevate breathing rate, which makes nasal breathing quite hard. So for me, double lunges for me is the hardest one.
Try to do some sandbag over the shoulder while nose breathing.
Right, exactly. So, that was a really good starting place to start experimenting with it, right? Like low intensity, moderate durations of aerobic work, starting predominantly cyclical. So that was just 30 minutes on the salt bike, try and keep it nasal, try to establish where your boundaries are, then start to kind of throw mixed modal elements in there, start to identify which movements are more challenging to keep nasal than others. And then, so today in the rowing protocol was, okay, well, I said I was going to start just with my nose. And then when I needed to move to the mouth, I would just move to the mouth. And I actually got through the first set surprisingly and was able to keep it all nasal, actually quite comfortably, and finished. And within 2 minutes of the 1K, I was back to comfortable nasal breathing. And then did the second set and thought, okay, there's probably going to be a point in here where I'm going to have to move to mouth breathing. Didn't happen. Got through it quite comfortably, and then got to the third set and did the same and was able to get through it. So interestingly, another learning from today was, often it's the post exercise, the moment you finish the set, where you have that sudden realization for the need for air. So I was able to finish the 1K row piece, and then was trying to keep it nasal as I got off the rower, but would like need to gasp for this.
You were exercising while maintaining nose breathing, but as soon as exercise ended, you felt like you had to switch to mouth breathing.
Yeah, and I only needed, just 2 or 3 breaths was enough. It was kind of like I was in this deficit.
Ed, you let out all the CO2. You broke the seal.
Well, this is exactly it. So then I thought, I got to the third set and I thought, I wonder, because, and it's also important for people to know when they start experimenting with these things, is that, when you start playing with nasal breathing and you're working towards your thresholds of where you can keep it nasal, it's not comfortable. It's the feeling it's asphyxiation. It's like you're drowning or you're suffocating or someone's strangling you.
What you're doing is you're resisting a very, very strong psychological or reflexive drive to breathe. It's a reflex, right? And you're consciously overcoming that reflex, and that is a challenge.
Yeah. And so they got to the third set and I thought, okay, I'm just going to really, really try and not go to those 2 or 3 breaths where I go to mouth, and was actually able to do it. We just had to be just really focused and try to sit as still as possible to conserve as much energy as possible. And actually, within 10 or so breaths through the nose, I was kind of back to just comfortable nasal breathing. So, and I feel like whilst it's not a measurable test, because we haven't done that test, and I'm not kind of retesting and seeing progress, but today felt like a breakthrough with nasal breathing in like an exercise induced setting. So, that was kind of my epiphany or kind of light bulb moment with it.
Well, you brought up one of the tools that I use really commonly, and I don't want to give away too much because I do coach, really competitive performance athletes. But one of the tools that I use to really try to impact people's subjective feelings of breathing is that return to nasal breathing post interval. Because what it does is it doesn't require people to spend time learning to nose breathe at lower intensities or anything like that. What it does is it takes you when you're at your most vulnerable and highest respiration rates, and you say, all right, now learn to recover faster. Right? I mean, if the thing that people use, if the marker, the physiological indicator they use to determine when they're tired is their breathing, and you train people over time to learn to recover their breathing quicker, then they're essentially going to assess themselves as recovered faster, right? Psychologically, whether or not they're physiologically recovering faster, I don't know. I haven't put, a Moxie monitor on them to figure that out. I haven't tracked heart rates during that time, but if you feel more recovered, then you're likely going to be able to perform better in your next interval. You're even going to go into it with more confidence. And anybody who's coached for a long time knows that a confident athlete, even in a physiologically less prepared state, is a dangerous athlete.
Yeah.
So
let's dig into this then. So we're on the topic of kind of nasal breathing in the on the topic of like aerobic conditioning or metcons, or let's just call it conditioning in the conditioning scenario. What are typically the training protocols that people should be thinking about, or applying nasal breathing to that scenario? What are some of the ways that people can go about it?
As you know, Ed, my philosophy is always assess first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a bolt test. And if you don't know what a bolt test is, but just quickly, and I honestly think people should go look for Patrick McKeown's videos on how to do the bolt, because anytime that I've verbally described it to somebody or typed it out to somebody, they don't do it right. And so they don't end up with a valid bolt score. So I'll explain the test. I'll explain the test briefly, but my recommendation would be to go find one of Pat McKeown's, or McKeown, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Find one of his videos and just follow his instructions. And he even has someone doing it on screen. Like, you can literally just follow along. But the bolt test is, he calls it the body oxygen level test. That's what BOLT stands for. And essentially you're going to exhale. You're going to take 3 normal breaths. And at the end of an exhale, you're going to hold your breath, and you must pinch your nose, because if you don't, I've watched enough people do this, the air starts to leak in through their nose. And the test ends when you get the very first reflexive drive to breathe. That might be swallowing. That might be a reflexive diaphragm contraction, where it's like one of the, like a gulp, essentially. It's not when you feel the first psychological drive to breathe. It's when you feel that first reflexive one. And the reflexive ones almost inevitably happen before you have any sense of panic or anything like that. Now, bolt scores. Typically, what Pat McKeown has recommended is, like, if you're below 10, that's like a medical issue. You're likely to have lots of airway or respiratory tract issues. You likely suffer from asthma with pretty much any level of exercise. If you're in that 10 to 20 range, then that's where, to be honest, it's where most CrossFitters that I've ever tested fall, somewhere between 10 and 20. Then you're likely, again, going to suffer from occasional, like, Fran lung type or Fran cough type scenarios, occasional respiratory infections from training, pretty much your typical CrossFitter's experience with their respiratory system. You'll have a pretty strong hunger for air when you do nose breathing, when you do breath holds, between barbell cycling, which really drives metabolic CO2 production up high. That would be your experience. And then if you're over that 20 range, 20 to 30, then some of those symptoms start to go down. And that's actually been pretty close to what my experience has been. When I started, my Bolt score was an 11, which I was borderline medical, which made sense, right? Like I had pretty frequent exercise-induced asthma. I had really frequent respiratory infections and sinus infections. And as my Bolt score has climbed, I think now my resting first thing in the morning Bolt score is somewhere between like 24 and 28, right? I no longer have any respiratory infection issues. Now, I still get out of breath in a Metcon. I'm not telling you that like this is some magic bullet where you're never going to get out of breath. It's just the point that I get out of breath in a Metcon happens later or at higher intensities than it used to. So that's your Bolt score. So that's, I think the first thing is assess yourself. If you're in that really low range, you probably need to adopt nose breathing at night. You need to adopt nose breathing all throughout your day and just start there. And then introducing any of the more aggressive protocols like nose breathing immediately post Metcon when your like respiration rate is at near max. Wait to do that stuff until you're closer to like 15, 16, 17 and nearing that 20-second Bolt score. And expect that to take some time to increase. But once you've done that,
real quick, Kyle. So, once you've identified your Bolt score, and let's say you are within that lower range, first protocol would just be to be conscious of where your breath's going and trying to spend as much of your day breathing through your nose. Because, I think we both agree a lot of people think they're nasal breathers, but until they actually become aware of it and think about it, I'm included in this category, by the way, they actually realize how often and unconsciously they move back to their mouth. So that's just a really good first step. And I think that alone will help improve someone's Bolt score.
One easy thing to do is talk to the people around you and just be like, hey, can you, for the next, I could talk to my wife and be like, hey, for the next day, can you just pay attention to the way I'm breathing? And anytime that I'm mouth breathing, can you just let me know and I'll close my mouth? And when I first started doing that, like I was bad and I didn't realize you personally don't realize how bad you are. But if you have someone who's watching you, especially someone who wants to correct you, man, you'll realize how bad.
Sick of your breath, Kyle. Close your mouth.
Yeah. Close your mouth.
Yeah. Okay. So there's your first step. Just become more aware of just breathing through your nose and
assess first.
And then if you are within that category, before even worrying about going to aggressive nasal protocols with your training, just think about trying to be as nasal as possible in your day-to-day activities.
Yeah, I'll be honest. If your Bolt score is below a 10, the likelihood that you're going to be able to do nose breathing running is extremely low. You would want to start with nose breath walking, right? Yeah. And I actually, to be completely, completely clear, when I started nose breathing running with a Bolt score of 11, I had to buy one of those nasal dilators to be able to do it. Like if my heart rate got to 135, I'd have to switch to mouth breathing because my nose was so blocked up and plugged up. And it was, over the course of months that I was able to like get to the point that I could easily do nose breathing running and not have to use a nose dilator and all that kind of stuff.
Something that's interesting was I know James Nestor says in breath, their general calculator for where your nasal breathing capacity is at was something like, I think 180 minus your age. I know it's a very general way to look at it, but beyond that, from a beats per minute heart rate standpoint, you're probably going to move to mouth breathing.
You want to know something really interesting?
Go.
When I use the nasal dilator, my nose breathing heart rate can be up to about 170, 172. My max being around like 189 at this point. Yeah. If I don't use it, then my heart rate threshold for switching from nose breathing is about 160. So it buys me about 10 beats per minute and actually quite a bit more intensity. Now, again, that's not something that I would do in a Metcon. Like if I look at any Metcon, if I look at my Whoop after any Metcon, my heart rate's always over 170. So like, why would I even try to nose breathe up at a threshold that's well beyond what I could do even with a nasal dilator. But I do think that's interesting that if you give yourself a little more airway space, the heart rates that you can continuously operate at while nasal breathing increase for sure.
Well, interesting. In the first week of experimenting, I remember my first aerobic session, and I was doing like a Tuesday aerobic session. It was nothing heavy, just a mixture of cyclical elements and kind of body weight stuff like burpees and light dumbbell snatches. And I tapped out at about 155 beats per minute was when I had to start going back to mouth breathing. And I'd kind of just give up the whole nasal breathing thing at that point and just move to mouth breathing for the remainder of the session. So today I was up at 174 beats per minute and was still comfortably maintaining nose breathing, which is very interesting. Yes, this was just rowing, so that is a little bit different still, but I thought that was quite interesting. Okay, let's switch back to the conditioning piece. So, we talked about assessing, and then we talked about just, being conscious of nasal breathing, and that's going to, help improve your bolt score most probably. Without going into kind of like CO2 protocols that's not related to exercise. Let's stick with exercise for now within the conditioning space. You talked about using a protocol like getting back to nasal breathing in between intervals as a method. What's the disadvantage, Kyle, of just for someone who has a decent bolt score, let's say they're in the 10 to 20 range or 20 to 30 range, what's the disadvantage of just going all in on the nasal breathing stuff with all your conditioning pieces?
Well, I think one of the potential disadvantages, depending on what event and sport they participate in, one of the potentials is that if you drive, if you're in that 20 to 30 range and you drive your CO2 tolerance too high, then you're going to start to be on the opposite end of that spectrum where you're driving muscle oxygen saturation too low without having the alarm bell of CO2 there to say, hey, you need to regulate your pace. So essentially you're losing your ability to regulate exercise based on breathlessness. Now, for someone who's in that typical 10 to 20 or even 20 to 25, I know I'm still very much there in that range, then continuing to create small improvements in your CO2 tolerance is going to make it so that alarm bell happens later. But if you're an ultra endurance runner or a marathoner and you use nose breathing protocols to drive up your CO2 tolerance to the 30 plus range for a bolt score, or the 40 plus range with a bolt score, which is definitely doable if you're an endurance runner who uses, nose breathing protocols all the time, then you basically just shut off your alarm bells to tell you, hey, you need to slow down. You need to back off your pace or you're going to crash. Because that's one of the purposes of CO2, really, that reflexive drive to breathe that you get with CO2. One of the purposes of that is just to make it so that you know when to stop exercise. But for most of us, that alarm bell just happens too early. So that would be the danger of using this too much. If you're a CrossFitter and you drive your bolt score up too high, then essentially you'll not know when to break in the middle of, say you're doing 20.5, doing the wall ball row muscle up from 2019 October Open. You won't know when to break. There won't be any signal. Like you'll get some burning in the muscle tissue and things like that, but you're not going to have that strong desire to stop that you get when you have, CO2 tolerance that's at like an adequate level. So there is an optimal level. And so that would be the danger. Now, for most people that are probably listening to this podcast, that danger is not real. That's why I say assess your bolt score. You'll probably realize that you've got a long time that you can be working with some nose breathing protocols before you're worried about it. So nose breathing protocols that I would suggest, right? We always start with an assessment. Once you've done your assessment, determine whether you're going to start with nose breathing walking or nose breathing at like lower intensities or, ramping protocols. So you mentioned the ramping protocol. That's one of my absolute favorites, right? A great example of that would be like a 10-minute assault bike. Increase the wattage, start at 200 and increase the wattage by 25 watts every minute. Start with nose breathing, carry your nose breathing as deep into it as you can, and switch to mouth breathing when you feel like you should. That gives you right away, it tells you what paces you should be holding or could be holding while nose breathing. And it tells you what heart rates you're likely to be able to hold while nose breathing. And it's a, it's a protocol. It's going to slowly ramp up CO2. And if you do that consistently, you did that 3-4 days a week, that's going to be a really potent stimulus to improve your CO2 tolerance. Then the other protocol that I really like, again, is the post-interval return to nose breathing. And I caution people that that's likely to be the most uncomfortable thing that they will do in their training, right? So you get done, let's just use Fran as an example, because it's such a classic, such a classic CrossFit workout. Get done with Fran. And then the moment that you finish, switch to nose breathing, right? Essentially what you'll see is most people's faces look pretty disfigured because they're trying to get as much air through their nose as possible. I have to lay down to do it, right? So it's like there's no option for me other than to lay on the ground and just suffer there for, a minute to a minute and a half. But what you'll find is that over the course of a couple of of training yourself to recover to nose breathing quickly, is that your actual recovery, your subjective feeling of recovery after a workout is dramatically improved.
I think it's important to note on that is that, especially with really hard, where you're really pushing intensities and thresholds, is that you're probably not going to get straight back to a nasal protocol for a lot of people. You may have to, like I was doing today, take a few breaths through the mouth and then try to get back to nasal as quick as you can. And then slowly.
Over time, that
will
the
improve.
number of mouth breaths that you have to take before will decrease.
Yeah.
Then what I would say, remember, that's a training protocol. Then one thing I would say is that when you take that and say you're in a competition where it's like every 4 minutes you're going to do X and X takes you 3 minutes. So you have a minute of recovery between. Don't do nose breathing during your 1 minute recovery in competition, right? Let yourself have as much air as you need, as your body tells you need to recover, and you'll actually recover even faster. Because what you're doing in training by taking yourself down to nose breathing immediately after a Metcons, you're restricting your air intake and you're training your body to recover better with less air intake. But you don't want to do that when you're competing.
Yeah.
Putting yourself at a disadvantage. Might as well breathe through a straw.
Yeah. You run, you in training, you may run with a vest on to make the run harder. But if you want to run your fastest 800, you're not going to stick a vest on.
In competition. Yeah, guys, I brought my weight vest today.
Okay, cool. Now, this is a big one for me within training, is the potential danger of, or it's not really a danger, but the limitation that you're setting on yourself by using nasal protocols all the time with your conditioning work, is that there's obviously a certain spectrum of training that you're potentially going to be missing out. And now for someone within the sport of CrossFit, that is like the upper echelons of really pushing it, very, very hard out efforts. And, in this time of the year, like with open prep for most people listening to this podcast, a lot of the work that we're going to be doing is really challenging heart rate and breath rate. And if you're restricting yourself to nasal protocols only, then you're just not putting your body in that place to make the necessary adaptations for the sport.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit already, but you said your heart rate with nose breathing kind of caps out around, what'd you say, 174, 175?
Yeah.
And I know that mine with no nasal dilator tops out about 162. I've never successfully done any Metcon and maintained my heart rate anywhere near 162. It's always way over that. So if I regulated all my intensities based on nose breathing, that means I'm missing out on any work, any training that's above 162 beats per minute. I'm going to be woefully unprepared when the open comes around, which is going to require me, in order to be competitive, to be in the 170 to 180 range for extended periods of time. And if you don't spend any time there, you're not prepared to do it.
Okay, nice. Let's create a framework then for people to start to think about, assuming that their bolt score is above the dangerously low range, the Kyle Ruth range. And they're now thinking about, okay, incorporating this in their training. What type of sessions in their week would they not lean on nasal protocols? And which type of sessions in their week would they perhaps think about leaning on nasal protocols with regards to conditioning?
There was a pretty recent Corpus Animus podcast, one of the Training Think Tank podcasts that I did with Ryan Sullivan, one of our other coaches. And we talked about the difference between training, testing, and competing.
Mm.
Very clearly with training, most of your training could be done with nose breathing or some sort of nose breathing recovery protocols between intervals. Maybe during training, you're doing some very high intensity, high heart rate based intervals. You wouldn't nose breathe during those, but you could easily use your nose breathing recovery between them. When you shift into the testing mode, so doing repeat open workouts, doing Metcons that, we release, Training Think Tank releases the Saturday throwdowns, right? Doing those Saturday throwdowns and using nose breathing is probably not a great idea, right? Because those are your opportunities to go touch the intensity of the sport. And then anytime you're competing, unless you're doing a very long endurance-based run where you can regulate your pace based on nose breathing and that you have used that tool quite a bit, I don't think you would want to use nose breathing for anything that you would be doing in a competitive scenario.
Okay, perfect. I love that analogy. Think about your nasal protocols more for a training based scenario. And then, for your sport specific or sport simulation type work. So in CrossFit, that's the testers that you guys are doing on a Saturday. We certainly do testers as well. Or if you see something in your program that's trying to prep you specifically or trying to simulate the actual thing you're preparing for, don't lean on your nasal protocols then. Okay, great. I want to finish this by talking about the concept of nasal breathing and its application to strength training. So that might be the application of strength training for people in the CrossFit space who are, leaning towards more of a strength bias, maybe training cycle or just a strength bias training program in general, but also kind of the communities outside of CrossFit. Maybe they're in powerlifting, bodybuilding, Olympic weightlifting. What's your thoughts on nasal protocols or nasal breathing in strength training?
Well, first off, I think those, in general, most of us would benefit from nose breathing all day, right? So from a health perspective, it doesn't matter, I don't think. Now, I may change my tune in 5 years, but I don't think that there is anybody that wouldn't benefit from nose breathing while they're sleeping, while they're wandering around, while they're doing the dishes. You know what I mean? Like that is just something that's healthy for us. But once you get into a training scenario, I think about, I could easily see someone who's like a power lifter, a novice power lifter who has learned a lot or comes from the breathing space. And they're like, oh, I'm going to nose breathe my hatch squat cycle. That I feel like is not a good idea. The Valsalva maneuver, where we do this breath hold to create this kind of fluid ball in the gut to really stabilize the spine. The Valsalva is something that keeps our spines safe, right? And nose breathing and trying to like inhale on the way down, exhale on the way up, and just keep this, relaxed breathing while doing heavy loaded, axially loaded spinal loaded work is probably not a great idea. So I think it's very important for people to be aware that like nose breathing is a tool for improving respiratory health, for regulating training intensity, for potentially improving Metcon or endurance performance, but it's not a strength training tool, right? It's something that if you integrated into heavy loaded strength training could potentially open you up for injury risk, for spinal injury risk. The diaphragm is one of our primary spinal stabilizers. And if it's not being used to stabilize the spine, and it's being used to, do deep nasal inhales while you have 315 pounds on your back, that's a risk for your lower back. So that would be something that I would say people want to avoid. Now, you mentioned nose breathing with CrossFit weightlifting, right? So if we talk about CrossFit, right, there's all kinds of different lifting in CrossFit. I might be cycling 75-pound power snatches, right? Which for me kind of resembles something that's a little more cyclical, right? It's more like hard rowing than it is like doing a 1RM squat snatch. And I think, at least this has been my own experience, that learning to nose breathe while cycling very light, empty barbell up to 75-pound power snatches has helped me learn to relax and match my breathing and effort to the movement rather than treating each one like a 1RM power snatch. That's been a good tool, but I think that's very individual. Everyone's going to have a different threshold for the loads that they can use while maintaining this more calm and relaxed breathing. And I also wouldn't do it in a Metcon, right? That was done in an EMOM where I was intentionally trying to learn to relax during cycling power snatches where I was using nose breathing there. Then the other piece that I would say for CrossFitters is during battery style lifting. So battery style being like, I'm going to do a clean at 225, rest 10 seconds, do another clean at 225, rest 10 seconds. One of the things that I've played with is switching to nose breathing between those lifts. And I've only done that so that I'm kind of capturing more of the CO2 that's being produced during each lift. One of the interesting things is that lifting relatively heavy weights, like a 225 power clean for me, drives up metabolic CO2 production quite a bit. So you're producing a crap load of CO2. And then what I'm trying to do is as soon as I drop the bar, I'm trying to capture that by switching back to nose breathing so that I can use that as a training tool or a training stimulus to kind of augment adaptation. But then as soon as I start to approach the bar, I switch back to mouth breathing, do my Valsalva, my brace, hit the rep, drop it, and then switch back to nose breathing. And I found that that could be a tool for improving the way that people feel during heavier barbell cycling, right? Changing the breathlessness sensation of barbell cycling. But to be clear, I'm not doing nose breathing during the 225 power snatch or power clean itself.
So it sounds like the incorporation of nasal protocols, kind of like you're talking about in the aerobic setting or the conditioning setting, which is like in the intervals, in the rest periods between efforts, is where you could really actually capture some good adaptations with your strength work, but actually incorporating it into the lifts themselves, especially with heavier loads where bracing is required from a spinal protection standpoint, not really a good idea.
Nailed it.
Perfect. Well, Kyle, this has been a cracking conversation. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your thoughts and insights, lessons and experience on the concepts of nasal breathing. I really think this episode really brings together a lot of the conversation that's been out there, ever since, Nestor, Wim Hof and all those guys went on Rogan, and people in the space have been experimenting a lot and trying to figure out how to actually make use of nasal breathing with training specifically. And I think this has provided a really good framework for people to actually go ahead and start using it in probably a smarter way and a more advantageous way. So thank you very much, Kyle, for your time. Kyle, for our listeners, where can people find out more about you?
You can check out my Instagram, KyleRuth_TTT. You can also check out all the educational content we've got on the Training Think Tank Classroom and frequently on the Corpus Animus podcast on all Training Think Tank media. So like YouTube, Training Think Tank, et cetera, et cetera.
Could you quickly tell us about the Training Think Tank Classroom, Kyle? What's it about and then why might people want to get involved?
Yeah, the Classroom is essentially it's our continuing education platform for coaches. Essentially what we do is we every month release a number of different elements, different pieces that are meant to serve as continuing education for primarily CrossFit coaches, for people who are full-time, class coaches, remote coaches, things like that. We've got things in there from a series that covers becoming a remote coach to how to use a spreadsheet so that you can actually, organize your programming, to energy system protocols, all the way up to, our newest release was using cannabis and training and whether or not it makes sense. Like we've got a really wide range of topics. So if you're a coach, someone who's a full-time, class coach or something like that, it's a perfect space for continuing education.
I mean, as a member myself, I actually think just the general consumer of CrossFit or athlete or person doing CrossFit or training in general who has an interest in like the why, what, and how behind what they do, I do think the Classroom actually is really beneficial for that type of person as well. People who just kind of want to find out a little bit more behind everything they do within this crazy sport. I'm a massive fan of it. Cool. Kyle, well, thank you very much for your time, my friend. And you have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Ed. You too.